Almost exactly 80 years ago at the time of posting, in August of 1945, the Second World War came to a close. It's hard to say if things have gotten any less hectic since, but conversely, it's pretty clear that the events of World War II, the decisions, the inventions, the sacrifices, would inform the next era. I'm RJ from Historic Autographs, and welcome, or welcome back, as we dive into one last episode to wrap up our series on World War II history. Episode 1 of this series ended with America joining the war following Pearl Harbor in 1941. Throughout the rest of the episodes, we've been able to look closely at pieces of before, during, and after the war, and here in the final episode, we're going to put it all together. 1941 was a big year because it was looking all too plausible that the Axis were going to succeed in their invasion goals, even if it was going to take a while. By this point, fighting had already been happening for ages. 2 years in Europe and almost a decade in Asia. It looked unlikely that Nazi Germany would be able to take Britain immediately, but since war was declared in 1939, Germany had been bombing Britain extensively, and it was taking a very real toll on morale. And with France occupied and no significant internationally organized defense, Germany was expanding their control through more and more of Western Europe and Africa. Germany's U-boats, military submarines, had even been contesting Britain's comfortable reputation as the strongest navy in Europe. Meanwhile, Japan had their puppet state of Manchukuo in northern China since 1932 and was putting more and more pressure on China and Pacific Island territories that Britain was desperately trying to protect. Then there's the fact that Germany and Soviet Russia had a non-aggression pact. By 1941, Germany controlled almost the entirety of Western Europe. The maps make it look like it was just Britain standing against a tide of Axis forces. Things were not looking up. But then again, Britain had been around for as long as they had because of how defensible their homeland is. Germany conquered Europe with blitzkrieg, with the overwhelming combined force of their ground army, tanks, and Luftwaffe. It's normally difficult to blitzkrieg Britain's shore, and Britain was confident they could hold out. Hitler was aware that conquering Britain might take too much time and too many resources. He figured Britain's plan was to hold out until either the United States or Soviet Russia finally joined the fight. So he took a chance and picked his poison by breaking Germany's non-aggression pact and invading the Soviet Union, hoping to wipe his way through Russia's biggest cities in one extended campaign. But Russia fought back hard, and a few months in, winter slowed the advance to a near standstill. Right around the same time, the pressure was mounting in the Pacific, as Japan was eyeing American protectorate states for invasion. Not one to be intimidated, Japan struck Pearl Harbor to scare America off and free up more territory, and that was a bad move. America nearly immediately declared their intent to join the war. They needed time to mobilize, but for Germany, that just meant the clock was ticking. Over the next year, Germany dug in their heels and tried to finish off Russia, but it proved impossible. In November of 1942, American troops began joining the British on military efforts to retake ground, starting with ocean control in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. Then, in July of 1943, about 2 years after Pearl Harbor, Britain, America, Canada, and Free France began retaking Europe in earnest, starting with Operation Husky. Allied forces poured into the Mediterranean and forced the Axis out of Sicily, using the island as a jumping-off point to take Italy. With southern Italy secured and fighting underway, the next step was opening a front for Britain to push back into France and Europe, and that plan was called Operation Overlord. Operation Overlord was the code name for the mission to open a front at Normandy, and it was the most important operation of the war in Europe. It was in development for years. Famously, it was sort of the ultimate test for World War II's espionage and information warfare, with significant effort going into obscuring Operation Overlord from the Axis, while also finding out what the Axis was expecting and using that to their advantage. The operation finally sprung into action on June 6, 1944, also known as D-Day, and it marked the beginning of the end for Germany. It only took a few months for Allies to liberate France, and after that it was time to push into Germany. See, despite taking over almost all of Europe, Germany was spread rather thin, especially fighting on the Western Front with Russia. And while some of the conquered nations welcomed their occupiers for varying reasons, a lot of them largely objected to being, conquered. And so it was a lot easier for Allies to disrupt Germany's control than it was for Germany to conquer them in the first place, especially with America's fresh and powerful army. Germany lost ground fast. There was fighting in almost every corner of Europe, as well as Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, but the Allies were focused on Berlin. They closed in, forming a big wave from both sides that met in the middle. The Russian army got there first. They stormed and captured Berlin, resulting in Nazi surrender on April 29, 1945. Allied military efforts were able to move to the Pacific, where they began the arduous process of invading island after island, working their way towards mainland Japan, while Russia invaded and dismantled Manchukuo. However, there was concern about how long and costly the fight would be to take Japan, given that Japan seemed unwilling to surrender despite the odds, supposedly due to their confidence in being able to defend the mainland until it was no longer worth it for the Allies to keep fighting. There are conflicting accounts, citing a variety of reasons from culture to mistranslations to calculated risk, but what matters is that ultimately, the United States decided to demonstrate their newly minted nuclear weaponry on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, after which Japan immediately surrendered. The war was over. After World War II came the establishment of NATO and the formation of the United Nations as an international peacekeeping coalition. Nazi leaders were tracked down and tried for war crimes, an ordeal known as the Nuremberg Trials, and a convention was held at Geneva to codify rules for non-combatants during warfare, with the hopes of preventing, or at least discouraging, a repeat of how the Axis, and some of the Allies too, treated civilians and prisoners of war. Japan and Germany were occupied by the Allies for some time, which had several implications we won't get into here. The Allies might have won, but once again Britain and France were decimated economically, not to mention the amount of lost lives and infrastructure. The United States created the Marshall Plan to help them rebuild. Speaking of the United States, owed to nuclear power and all those other favorable factors, the U.S. became one of the world's two superpowers. The other was Soviet Russia. Soviet Russia was also decimated by the war, but immediately following World War II, they occupied several Eastern European nations which were previously under Nazi control, extending their reach and access to resources. Under Stalin's regime, they used these resources, along with many work camps, to become an authoritarian superpower with the resources, numbers, and economic output to rival the United States' industrial might. This was worrying to the United Nations because despite being allied in World War II, despite how much Russia contributed to winning the war against the Nazis, Stalin's regime was fascist. It looked very similar to the behavior we fought to stop. Everyone feared another war might be imminent. But this time, there was a new piece in play: nuclear technology. It didn't take long for Russia to finish developing their nuke. They did it in 1949, and it had everyone rightfully terrified. America having nukes was one thing, their very existence was worrying, but the two largest countries in the world, effectively polar opposites, beefing with each other while both possessed enough nuclear power to level the Earth? The next decade or so would go on to be known as the Cold War. A war with no actual fighting, because despite standing in opposition to each other, both countries fought tooth and nail to keep themselves from fighting, for fear that armed conflict would escalate into total nuclear destruction. Heavy stuff. Winning the war was a great triumph for the democracies of the world, and it is very much worth celebrating. But let's be real here, it was also the end of an extremely turbulent 3 decades of bloody global warfare, and a bonus decade defined by paranoia and the threat of nuclear annihilation. That kind of thing creates profound trauma, not just in people, but in societies. And our society is a global one, billions of people strong. When you break history down into chunks, as we often do, you might not think about the fact that all of this stuff happened back to back in 5 to 10 year increments. Someone born in 1900 could have theoretically hit teenagehood in time to witness World War I, early adulthood in time for the Roaring Twenties, parenthood in time for World War II, and be planning for retirement in the middle of the Cold War. And that goes for everyone, not just America. And that's if you survived. It's hard to say how that has affected our course of action, though. The world's a big place. And here in America, there was a lot of prosperity to enjoy that feels like a bit of a barrier between then and now. America's thriving post-war economy made way for a baby boom, as American families cashed in on war bonds and social programs and started families with the windfall. The technological advancements of World War II would go on to create an information revolution. Computers, mass marketing, the space race, eventually the internet. Humanity recovered and kept moving. And that's the vibe, right? That's the glory and the stuff that they weave into war movies and history textbooks to find the light in the prevalent darkness of the first half of the 1900s. World War II proves that we're not safe, that we have to learn from mistakes and work to apply them, that we have to be discerning and observant and active on an individual scale, a national scale, and a global scale, that balance is precious. But it also proves so very clearly that there is a profound power in the tenacity of humankind. And if we have that, we'll probably make it through. Everyone, thank you for tuning into this World War II series provided by Historic Autographs. It's been quite the ride, and we hope you enjoyed. Feel free to leave comments, like the video if you liked it, and subscribe for more history and sports cards content. We've also got our website in the description where you can find our products, including our upcoming World War II product featuring signatures, relics, art cards, and more. See ya!